Hello everyone, and welcome to a special GZERO live stream. We're coming to you today from Munich, Germany, site of the 2023 Munich Security Conference. I'm Nick Robertson, International Diplomatic Editor for CNN. This program is part of GZERO's Global Stage series presented in partnership with Microsoft. At this very conference 1 year ago, heads of state, military leaders and diplomats expressed deep concerns about an impending invasion of Ukraine. There were vigorous debates about whether Russia's President Vladimir Putin would defy their warnings and what the consequences should be if he did. On February 24th, 2022, we learned the answer and a war began. We're beginning to examine what has happened since, what happens next, and what it means for the world. I'm joined today by Ian Bremmer, President and founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, by NATO's Policy Planning Chief, Benedetta Berti, Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of Microsoft, and Comfort Arrow, President and CEO of the International Crisis Group. Welcome to you all. We're going to talk about the lessons of this first year of the war in Ukraine, the road ahead in the conflict, and then broader security threats the world faces. There's lots to discuss, so let's dive right in. Ian, last year, 2022, you said that if there was a war, it would last a long time. Break it down. What did you mean back then, and is that bearing out your concerns?
I just couldn't imagine, given the scale of what we were talking about, that the Europeans were suddenly going to fold, and that also the Russians would be in a position that they could lose. And unfortunately, I think, even 1 year on, what we're seeing is leaders from all over the West not seeing even a remote possibility of an exit ramp, a remote possibility of negotiations getting started, knowing even how to address that issue. And as a consequence, having no idea what life might look like after a war is over. I've never seen the fog of war feel this thick when we're talking about NATO.
And you said recently that Vladimir Putin had underestimated the US and NATO and wouldn't have invaded if he knew what the response would be. Can you explain that and perhaps why, having seen the response, he continues?
Well, I think that the United States, the Germans, frankly, pretty much all the NATO allies deserve incredibly high marks for the way that they have cohered and responded to this war from February 24th. I do not believe they deserve high marks for what they were doing vis-a-vis Russia before February 24th. And I think there were lots of signals that were being given. We can talk about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, largely decided ultimately unilaterally and annoying a lot of allies that were asked by the Americans to go in, but weren't asked by the Americans, hey, should we now go out? I think you had Macron talking about strategic autonomy and saying NATO was brain dead. You had 4 years of Trump, and then on top of that, Biden meeting with Putin and saying, let's focus on cyber, but didn't bring up Ukraine in his one-on-one meeting. And then you had, of course, Merkel's leaving the stage, very much tougher in leading any charge or challenge to Putin, and instead Social Democrat Olaf Scholz, who was seen as more of a Russian understander. I think if you were Putin, looking at all of those things and seeing the lack of response of the West after the 2014 invasion or 2008 in Georgia, you can be forgiven for understanding why he might have thought he could get away with what he perpetrated on February 24th. And that misjudgment was immense, but I do think the West bears some responsibility for it.
Benedetta, let me come to you on that then, bearing the responsibility for perhaps not having this joined up messaging. And do you think NATO and allied nations underestimated Russia? And should they have been having a more joined up message before? And to that as well, was NATO prepared for this abrupt end in peace that we're witnessing?
Right. Well, I would say that when Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine started, we were shocked, of course, by the brutality and by the scale and the speed, but we were not surprised. The signs were there. The intelligence was there. We had extensive consultations. So in that sense, I do not think we had underestimated Russia's strategy and what they were planning to do in Ukraine. And from a NATO perspective, I would say that our real wake-up call came in 2014. With Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. That changed the way we looked at security. We went from decades of thinking that threats and challenges will come from out of area and would be more asymmetric, unconventional, to really refocusing back to territorial defense of Europe. And ultimately, we took a series of decisions to rebuild our ability to do collective defense. And had we not done that, then there's no way that after Russia began its war of aggression, we would have been able to react so fast, really within hours and days, in terms of thickening the eastern flank, strengthening our deterrence and defense, approving defense plans, resetting our deterrence and defense posture. So all of that, to me, shows that we really had not underestimated the importance of resetting, relearning, and rebuilding our ability to do deterrence and defense. If anything, maybe at the beginning we had overestimated the Russians' military capabilities. And I think that's something that the Ukrainians, through their bravery and strength, have shown us, that this myth of invincibility has been busted. At the same time, I think it would be a real strategic mistake if we started to underestimate what Russia could do in the future. We need to remain very vigilant because we see the country as a very high threshold for pain. And I think the way they are behaving shows that they haven't really significantly changed their strategic objectives. So we shouldn't underestimate them.
I just want to follow up a little on that. On deterrence, that was stepped up very fast. But in terms of where we are today, it would seem that perhaps the defense manufacturing capacity, artillery shells, these things which are in short supply today, were they ready for this extensive engagement of attrition?
I think that's a very good question. And the reality is that our defense industry for decades shifted away from producing at that scale and mass that is now required for this type of high intensity conventional war. And that means that we need to adapt. And that's why you hear from the Secretary General of NATO the very clear call: we need to ramp up production. We need to do that together as allies. We need to work with the industry. So there's a clear need to catch up. And that's important, both so that we can continue to keep a very strong deterrence and defense posture, but also so that we can continue to supply Ukraine with what it needs to exercise its right to self-defense. So yes, we are adapting to what is essentially a war at a scale and speed and that we hadn't seen for decades.
Brad, you have a perspective on this. How has the private sector technology industries responded to what they're witnessing in Ukraine? And I just want to ask about as well cybersecurity, which is kind of part of the picture that we just don't see so much.
I think it's a really important time for us to step back at the 1-year mark and ask, what will history remember as being most noteworthy about the first 12 months of this war? First, I would point to the fact that everyone underestimated Ukraine, and in particular, President Zelensky's ability to use technology to really rally the support of the world. It was last Saturday afternoon here in Munich, a year ago, on the Saturday afternoon, when the professional diplomats, and there are many capable professional diplomats here, said, oh, how could he leave his country and come speak in Munich? He must not be experienced in the art of diplomacy. He has redefined the art of diplomacy, fundamentally using digital technology to speak directly to publics and governments around the world and consistently rally their support. The second thing that the Ukrainians have shown is not just, I think, the tenacity that perhaps we expected, but a level of agility, including agility in the use of technology. They decided to change their law just a few weeks before the war began, move all of their data out of their own data center into the public cloud, Microsoft, AWS, others. So by the time the first Russian cruise missile literally destroyed their data center, the data had been copied and evacuated. Third, as you point out, we have found that there's been this new level of collaboration with the Ukrainian government, with the United States and the UK and NATO, and across the tech sector, which to date has really successfully thwarted Russian cyber attacks designed to destroy Ukrainian digital infrastructure. And fourth, we have this ongoing battle, if you will, in cyberspace around influence operations, one where the Russians are very sophisticated, where I think you'd say they're winning on the home front so far. They're sustaining the critical level of public support needed for them to fight a long war, but haven't so far been able to really degrade the level of public support in other countries, including Ukraine itself, in part because we and others are detecting what they're doing and alerting people to the messages that they should be skeptical about because they're coming from Russia itself.
And would that be another part of Putin's failing of misunderstanding the unity of the West, the resolve of the West, the resolve of Ukraine, to misunderstand that in the past he might have had an easy path to this sort of international message influence, and that he didn't see the defense coming on that?
I think, the two of you alluded to it as well. Look, anyone who lived through what happened in Crimea would probably start with the premise that the West would not act with the resolute and determined unity that it has. So many things have changed, and that is clearly, I think, one of the most important.
Comfort, let me come to you here. You have another part of the picture, of course. You came to the leadership of your organization just 2 months before the war in Ukraine began. What's been the impact on your mission and more broadly the humanitarian mission with this particular conflict as we see it in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. It was also a stark reminder of how we need to sort of double down on the kind of work we do, particularly around prevention and mitigation and resolution as well. And what struck me by what you both said was that you weren't surprised, shocked, but still not surprised. Crisis Group, Nick, we produce every year what we call 10 conflicts to watch. And in the one that we produced last year, and even before, we said take President Putin at his word, that he wasn't bluffing. What we couldn't determine, as you rightfully said, was the scale of the intervention, the depth of the war, and how far he would go. But there were already enough signs out there that he was going to pursue some kind of military adventurism. So even when you talk about some of the failures of the international actors, I still think there's a lot of work to be done on prevention, but not just on prevention, but the anticipatory policies that have to accompany prevention. No actor, what surprises me is that no actor says they're surprised by what happened. And then you have to ask yourself, then what about the steps you ought to have taken? Now, there is a school of thought out there that suggests the deterrence. We put so much deterrence on the table, but Putin was already clear about his strategy, and that strategy was defined a decade or so ago. But then you have to ask yourselves about the leverage that you have and what went wrong, between 2014 and then today. Some would argue that the original sin actually was the failure to handle 2014 significantly, and others would come back even earlier and say the original sin was a much earlier, which you alluded to. You mentioned Georgia, I didn't. So there are I think there are a number of important questions that must be asked, a number of assessments. But today is not the time for assessment. I think the focus today must be finding a way to end the war and to make sure that it lands well. For Ukraine. This has been quite devastating, and we can come back and ask ourselves, what ifs and why, and now focus on how to bring an end to this very awful war that we're seeing today.
Well, this is where we're going to get to in a moment here. So before we turn to what a second year or beyond could look like in Ukraine, I wanted to share with you a portion of Ian's interview with Finland's former Prime Minister, Alexander Stubb. This is from the World Economic Forum in Davos last month. Ian, you asked him about the threat Russia poses to the broader region in Europe and beyond. Let's listen to that.
If you have a 1,340 kilometer border with Russia, you always have to be concerned because, as we can see, Russia is quite unpredictable. I mean, one of the reasons that we have one of the largest standing armies in Europe with over 900,000 men in reserve and 280,000 that can be mobilized in wartime is not exactly because we want to defend ourselves against Sweden. It is because there is a real Russian threat. So never underestimate the capacity of Russians to cause havoc. So in that sense, I think you always have to be wary. Now, Russia did used to have basically three things that they could threaten all of us with. One was energy. Well, that's almost gone. One was the economy. That's gone.
Almost gone.
And one was military. And we're sort of looking at it, well, you know, if you can't even take over Ukraine, why go anywhere else?
So, Ian, this fear or that the war could spill over to other nations, is that unfounded?
I want to return to the comment from our colleague from NATO, which is do not underestimate the Russians in this situation. The war has gone reasonably well for NATO so far. Ukraine, of course, is suffering mightily. But the idea that the Russians are incapable of doing anything to NATO because they haven't so far is, I think, an assumption you don't want to make. Russia is becoming the most powerful rogue state in history. And we have seen that a much less powerful Iran has caused an enormous amount of problems in their backyard, in their region: proxy wars, espionage, terrorism, drone strikes, misinformation, you name it. The Russians have not really started to do that against NATO, against frontline NATO states. And I think that we should assume that if the West holds together as it has, and the Russians continue to fail in achieving their outcomes in Ukraine, which we all are hoping is the case, that Putin is not just going to sit there on his hands. I mean, he controls the disinformation space in Russia, and he is saying that the Russians are fighting a war not against Ukraine, but against NATO. And I think that we should recognize that we will start to see asymmetric attacks from Russia against NATO.
Benedetta, is NATO ready for these asymmetric attacks that could probably come?
Well, I would say that, well, of course, long story short, yes, but that's because since 2014, again, we have seen a pattern of destabilizing behavior from Russia that included using many tools in the hybrid toolbox, from disinformation to attempts to interfere in elections, to cyber attacks, to assassinations on the soil of NATO allies. So it is not as if we haven't dealt with a defiant and provocative Russia when it comes to the hybrid spectrum. So since 2014, again, the alliance has been strengthening its cyber defenses, its defenses against hybrid threats, has been stepping up cooperation on countering disinformation. But more and more, and I think that's really the point, we are understanding that our security is connected to a number of non-kinetic threats and challenges, from economic coercion to energy manipulation. And that really forces us to broaden the spectrum of how we look at security. And that's very much something that I think it's relevant to Russia's war against Ukraine and to its tactics, but it's broadly relevant to dealing with a world of rising strategic competition.
Okay, well, let's take that look forward now. Let's turn now to the future as this war enters its second year. First ahead on this live stream, GZERO conducted a poll of followers across its social channels on some of the topics we're discussing here today. Here's the first question. The war in Ukraine will end in a ceasefire, expand beyond Ukraine's borders, end in victory for Ukraine, Russian withdrawal, continue indefinitely. And here's how people voted. End in a ceasefire, 20%. Expand beyond Ukraine's borders, 16%. End in a victory for Ukraine, Russian withdrawal, 32%. Continue indefinitely, 32%. Anyone want to comment on that?
They have no idea.
Yeah.
Again, fog of war.
Yeah.
No one sitting here. We've been here for one day so far at Munich Security Conference. There is no one that I have met, no government official, no public policy intellectual, no corporate leader that has a view with confidence that they know how this war is going to conclude after a year of incredibly brutal fighting that has had displacement impacts on the economies all around the world. This is the biggest risk on the global stage that we have seen by far since the wall came down in 1989, and the uncertainty that we see in response to this poll should discomfort all of us.
Comfort, I want to come to you because it seems to me when you look at the numbers on the polling here, that 64% really just see this war as going on. So the humanitarian cost is going to continue. How does an organization like yours, how do you plan for and cope with that? Because there are still millions upon millions of Ukrainians in their country. Germany witnessed an influx of people from Syria. 2015, that upset the political table across Europe. What do you anticipate?
Yeah,
How do we cope?
I want to pick up on what you said, Ian. You talked about the displacement of the economies, the displacements of people right across Europe, and the amount of refugees that are fleeing Ukraine, the human cost of suffering, the sheer humanitarian scale of the crisis. And that's just Ukraine. We haven't talked about the other crises that we need to focus on. I mean, by the way, last year, everybody's got Ukraine in their headline, but the most deadly violent conflict last year was not Ukraine, it was Ethiopia. So you add that into the mix and you see that the international humanitarian system is under significant strain, is under significant challenges. And how do we begin to sort of roll back this cost of human suffering, the refugee flow, the fact that we don't have a sort of a sufficient response to roll that back and to treat, to deal with the scale of civilian protection that is necessary. That's just one side of the dilemma. And then you add the global impact of Ukraine's crisis coming in the midst of the back off of COVID-19, coming at the time of climate change, coming at the time of a global economic recession, and then inflation, and a number of countries. One of the unintended consequences of the conflict has been the impact on a number of countries that were already suffering, who are already fragile, and now facing a tsunami of other crises because of the fallout of Ukraine, because various international actors were caught off guard, not realizing that food insecurity, economic shocks, the commodity shock was also going to have an impact on a number of countries way beyond Europe. So this is not just about Europe. This has global, far-reaching ramifications that we need to tackle. Otherwise, we're going to face other looming crises down the line. You asked me what my business was, prevention and early warning, and we're warning every time that when you get an interlocking and intersecting conflicts, one conflict in one region doesn't stay in that region. It has a tendency to spill over and have huge ramifications and implications for other parts of the world. And that, I think, is a really important warning shot to all of us, that Ukraine doesn't stay in the borders of Europe. It goes global to other parts of the world.
Let me just come to you, Benedetta, on a question that's been floated in the background before and strongly by Ukraine. Should Ukraine be allowed to join NATO? What are the implications for the alliance? What are the implications for Ukraine? Is that a pathway to ending this sooner?
Right. So just to frame it, when it comes to membership, NATO has very clear rules. They were written even in 1949 in the North Atlantic Treaty, and that is the open door policy, which basically says, in a few words, NATO is open to European democracies who are able and willing to contribute to the security of the alliance and will share the alliance's value. And that policy has been reaffirmed by NATO allies time and time again over the past 74 years. So that policy remains valid. And the proof that the policy remains valid is, of course, that NATO over the years has grown as an alliance, and that's growth has been, I think, an historical success when it comes to enabling further European integration, bringing security to millions of people, when it comes to supporting the sovereign aspirations and the Euro-Atlantic aspirations and choices of sovereign countries. And just in recent years, of course, NATO has added 2 new members, Montenegro and North Macedonia. So I'm saying all this to say NATO's door remains open, and that is a policy that allies are keen to reiterate time and time again. They have also said, and they continue to say that last time they met in Madrid, only a few months ago, that the decisions they've taken on membership, so Ukraine and Georgia, remain valid. So these two countries have expressed interest in joining the alliance, and the alliance has said, yes, these countries will become members. So all of that remains on the table. At the same time, it's also very important that we understand, I think, the gravity of the situation, and that's why today the focus must be for us on practical support to Ukraine, both bilaterally, but also non-lethal provision of support through NATO. That is because we can't have a debate about the political future of Ukraine if there is not a sovereign Ukraine. And we also have to be very clear, I think, as an alliance, that a sovereign, independent and democratic Ukraine is key to stability and peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. So it's something that also is important to us. But now the focus is support Ukraine in its right to self-defense, support it in the long term, support it through what we've seen from the poll. We don't know what the war is going to look like, but we know we need long-term support. We know reconstruction, development. This will be a generational effort, and that's where we're focusing our energies. And I think that's the right thing to do in this particular moment of time.
And Brad, from a tech sector point of view, what are the lessons that are learned and what can be done for where we go forward from here?
Well, I think on the lesson side, what the first year at least has found is that in a hybrid war, when we're talking about cyberspace, defensive technologies have proven to be more powerful than offensive technologies. So this is a real shift from where we were, say, in 2017, when there was the Russian NotPetya attack on Ukraine. That's good news for year one. I think we both have to sustain and maintain that, I'll say, comparative advantage of defense over offense, especially if there's a risk of more attacks that go beyond Ukrainian borders. But then second, I think we just need to keep in mind that the longer a war persists, the greater the risk for fatigue eroding a country's ability to wage war. This is true in Russia, this is true in Ukraine and for NATO, to varying degrees and in different ways. But ultimately, I think it's always more difficult for a democratically elected government to sustain that kind of political support, public support. Now, for the tech sector, the first thing it means is that we need to sustain our support. If there's one thing that maybe surprises me more than anything else coming back to Munich a year later, it's that we at Microsoft have devoted $435 million of financial and technology aid to Ukraine. I would have never predicted that a year ago. And that's why I think it's been important for us to say we have extended our support through all of 2023. We'll take this 1 year at a time. We'll continue to provide Ukraine what it needs to defend itself, as well as the other NATO countries, especially those closest to Ukraine. And we'll work with this, in effect, new alliance, if you will, that brings together Ukraine, NATO, and a private sector that's had to work in a way that's different from, say, the way the private sector worked to support allies in World War II or elsewhere. But we need to sustain that and resist the temptation to succumb to fatigue.
So on that note, fatigue on this, but let's look at the broader picture as well. Russia's war in Ukraine is one of several converging crises globally, and certainly its impact has been compounded by the years of COVID pandemic, which has already weakened economic and withered the equality gap. We're going to talk about the broader threat landscape, but first I want to share with you a second viewer poll. Before this live stream, GZERO asked followers this question: which of these global threats concerns you the most? Nuclear proliferation, cyber warfare, climate change, weaponization of AI. And here's what GZERO's followers voted. Nuclear proliferation, 25%, cyber warfare, 14%, climate change, 36%, weaponization of AI, 25%. So Brad, if I come back to you on this, AI is having a giant moment of growth at the moment. To what extent is that development at risk by these broadened threats?
I don't think it is fundamentally at risk by these broader developments. I think the pace of technology change is driving improvements in AI forward very quickly. And one of the things that I find just fascinating and important about the development of AI and one that we're experiencing every day, is as people identify problems, and there are, it's an infant technology, it's actually an area where if you take the problem seriously and you have an engineering team that's willing and prepared to work on a moment's notice, you can correct the problems far faster than you can solve most problems in life. That's a good thing. Rarely do we have problems that one can solve in hours to days. Usually we spend our time, as we should, talking about problems that will take months to years. Now, the one thing that is broader here, in my view, is that there is a race going on for the future of AI. And it's fundamentally it's between the private sector in the United States and the public sector in China. That's where the early leaders are, and we'll see more emerge over time. But I think the most important thing is that we set a new path where the United States and the West as a whole, the world's democracies, are ahead technologically and are setting the right role model and creating the right international norms for the responsible use of AI. We have to do both of those things together, and I think we're off to a good start, but like everything else, a good start only lasts as long as you keep at it, and we have to stay determined and focused on this.
Ian, in your top risk report this year, you referred to a tipping point for AI. Is it leaning towards better or worse?
Oh, it's leaning towards better in the sense that the productivity gains that are coming from AI are going to be absolutely startling. But the fact is that it's still an enormously concerning risk because the technology is in its infancy and is taking off like a hockey stick or like a rocket ship. Look, the interesting thing that came out of that survey just now is that cyber was at the bottom. Now, it's not like offensive cyber actors have gone away, and it's not like they've gotten worse. It's just that as the threat has become more known and you've had time and resources to devote to it, to apply to it, it turns out that you're able to have effective cyber defenses. Well, you haven't had that time with AI at all. And also in the private sector right now, there is a bit of a downturn for some companies that are taking people off of the concerns of public security and monitoring and disinformation. Those two things together make me more concerned that AI in the near term has and influence campaigns and misinformation and all of the social ills, security ills, and economic ills that come from it are going to be much more significant than what we're seeing from cyber over the course of the coming years.
Cyber did get a sort of a big walk up to this conflict. I mean, there was its threat outsized to beyond what it was going, how useful it was, how effective it would be?
That's a Brad question.
Brad, your question.
I think that, look, everyone, I think, in hindsight, overestimated Russian capabilities and underestimated Ukrainian capabilities in every aspect of this war. So we shouldn't be surprised in that context that cyber fits that description. We very much underestimated the agility of Ukraine to really rely on cyber defenses and I think this alliance with the tech sector. And it's not that the Russians haven't been vigorous or determined or persistent. They've been all three of those things. But so far, they just haven't been successful at a strategic level. Just say in the last month, we've seen a bit of a resurgence in Russian efforts in cyberspace. They sort of took, I think, December to regroup, but starting about the 12th of January, we saw new efforts. And what's most interesting, I think, is how similar it is to what we saw them try to do a year ago. They innovated with some new forms of malware. They focused on the same targets that they did a year ago, namely the defense sector in Ukraine, the media sector, and the energy sector. But so far in 2023, like 2022, they haven't been able to break through the defenses, and we just have to keep investing to ensure that they remain stronger than what is being thrown at them.
Ian, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Oh, I was just going to say that we're talking a lot about NATO and countries, but the reality is that there's a good chance that Zelensky is not in power today if it's not for the action of technology companies quickly in response to this war. Microsoft on cyber, also SpaceX and Elon Musk on communication. That is a very big deal. Let us be clear. These companies are not NATO signatories, right? And it's easier to support Ukraine and go after Russia when Russia's a comparatively small economy, a comparatively small commercial opportunity, and Ukraine has so much popular support from the West, at least. If this were an invasion, God forbid, of China against Taiwan, I fear those decisions would be a lot more difficult, if not unmakeable.
Yeah.
And I don't think governments, Western governments that are supporting Taiwan are actually prepared for that conversation.
China is really an area where NATO is beginning to have a stronger view. We heard that in Madrid last summer. Is NATO itself, assuming the worst happens and we arrive in that kind of scenario where you are facing these unimaginable questions that Ian is speaking about, how prepared is NATO to tackle this same threat in that theater?
Well, I think that's a very important question. And as you said, NATO as an alliance has started really recognizing that if you want to talk about the transformation of the security environment, you have to understand China's rise and its impact. And that's going to have profound implications also on Euro-Atlantic security. So the way NATO is navigating that question is, at the moment, we are very clear that as an alliance, NATO doesn't see China as a military adversary, right? But at the same time, it is clear that China's stated ambitions and behavior on the global stage are a challenge to the alliance interests and values, and that there will be a direct impact. There is a direct impact on Euro-Atlantic security. So the lens is, how can we, first of all, foster more transatlantic convergence when it comes to understanding what are we talking about? What is this challenge? What are its multifaceted aspects? Because that's really important. If you want to have a joint response between the West, first of all, you have to see the world in a similar way. So first of all, we are building that situational awareness. Then we're also focusing on resilience. Resilience is incredibly important because a lot of the challenges that we face, and not just coming from China, are connected to the resilience of our critical infrastructure, physical and digital. They are connected to our economic vulnerabilities. They're connected to our strategic dependencies when it comes to supply chain security, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working on that as well. And then we're working more on partnerships, because when it comes to standing up for the rules-based international order, we work as an alliance, but we work more and more also with partners, with other countries that are not necessarily NATO members, but that share our values and our interest in upholding the rules-based international order. And that's why in Madrid, as you mentioned, at the last NATO summit, for the first time, we invited the heads of state and government of our four partner countries from the Indo-Pacific: Australia, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand. That was a clear signal that we are really taking a global approach when it comes to understanding the implication of strategic competition. That does not necessarily mean taking an active military confrontational rhetoric or role.
But on the issue of AI and the way that China may use its developments in AI and the cybersecurity issue, as Ian has suggested, it's a much bigger actor than Russia is. And is China really going to sit back on its heels and wait for its decisions if there's still a conflict going on in Ukraine that's keeping the West distracted? I'm just wondering how prepared NATO can be for that level of threat coming from China, the level that Ian indicated could be there. Because the battlefield may be a long way away.
That's right. But these are important conversations that are going on in the transatlantic community about, first of all, understanding the connections between security developments in the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, and really linking those two theaters and understanding what are the potential risks, and then thinking about which organization or platform is best suited to answer different aspects of that challenge. So it is a complex conversation. I think at the moment, of course, in terms of where is NATO's main focus in terms of military adaptation, it is rebuilding our deterrence and defense posture against all threats. That is not a country-specific deterrence and defense posture. It is, we call it 360, means against all potential competitors and adversaries. But it's also about really, again, I go back to this point about resilience. It's really, really important. And in a situation of conflict, we also need to be able to protect our societies, to foster and develop our private sector. And all of it is related to our ability to be collectively more resilient. So we're definitely focusing on that. We're also focusing on the technological dimension that has been mentioned throughout the last conversation. Part of the way through which the alliance has always retained the ability to do deterrence and defense so successfully is because it has always retained a technological edge over its potential adversaries. Today, that technological edge is challenged in a way that it hasn't been, at least not that aggressively, for a long time. So we are very aware that that has to be a strategic priority for the alliance. Foster innovation, promote transatlantic cooperation on emerging and disruptive technologies, be an engine for transatlantic innovation. And these are all tools that I think are essential for us to retain our technological edge and ultimately do well in a world of strategic competition.
Comfort, you're obviously tracking conflicts in many parts of the world, and you mentioned some of them, particularly Africa and the death toll in Ethiopia. You're clearly watching that. But and you mentioned at the beginning as well how the invasion of Ukraine was something that we'd seen coming, and that your strategy as a NGO to tackle that threat is to try to get in there ahead of it. So here we are discussing China and the potential threats there. How do you view that?
Yeah. Can I just, before answering that question, come back to the conversation that was taking place here on technology? I mean, that's true, especially what you said, Ian, about how it played an important role to sustaining Zelensky and to help in Ukraine in the beginning. But it doesn't take away from the fundamental facts that it's still very much a conventional war that we're also fighting. You know, boots, soldiers dying, and that's really still very much at the heart of the war. You know, people are dying. You know, people aren't just pressing buttons elsewhere. You know, there's mud in the place. There, you know, soldiers working through very different trench lines that we haven't seen in a long time. So I don't think we should overlook that fact and that reality of the day-to-day grind of the war on men and women that are in this war. If we all think that Ukraine, Russia, the Russian assault is our big headache, we've got a bigger headache down the line in terms of what happens vis-a-vis Taiwan. But I will just walk back a little bit and say that, in a sense, what has taken place vis-a-vis Ukraine has also been instructive to China and how it positions itself in relation to the South China Sea and how it's going to handle Taiwan. This has been a messy headache for Xi Jinping. You know, Putin whispered all sorts of ideas into his head about how this was going to be a quick victory, how he was going to march into Ukraine, this will be done and dusted. This has been quite disastrous for Russia, and that alliance that you're seeing between Xi Jinping and Putin, you know, I would also wonder from Xi Jinping's perspective whether he sees Putin as a reliable strategic partner in the future. So that's just one part of the calculation. The other thing also is that, you know, in a sense, the risk of whether there will be some kind of attack onto Taiwan, while it's high, the risk still sort of remains low in a sense. We don't necessarily see it happening in the near term. No, one, China doesn't necessarily have the military capability that everybody thinks it has. Two, I think it would be very nervous in terms of how the West has reacted to Ukraine, the coming together on the sanctions, the unity that it's in. I think these things are also giving Xi Jinping a headache as well. But thirdly, quite frankly, if we are concerned about Ukraine, this will be a tsunami. If there was some kind of confrontation between the economic shocks that we've seen so far will be even more seismic than they are. The global confrontation will be even worse than that we're seeing today. So if there's a way in which we can also double down on this. Now, unfortunately, Nick, the situation has gotten a little bit more complicated between the US and China. You know, I was in Washington just before coming here at the time of the Bloom gate, and you know, it's very clear to us that both sides need to talk, that we need that line of communications open, that we need to establish what the guardrails are so that we don't see this kind of misinformation, miscalculation that could take place. It's a really worrying time in terms of US-China competition, and either side can go in the wrong direction. It's also interesting how a public incident like this will force decision makers to take this kind of reaction. And I think it just further reinforces just how brittle the relationship is between both sides and how they're both going to be defining their own international relations within that lens of their own competition. You can cooperate and compete at the same time. The question is whether they're both able to park those interests and work together as well at the same time.
And this, I think, is a message that President Biden tries to put forward. The not confrontation.
Yeah.
Brad, but let me
just one more point. Look, on your poll, I don't think we should miss the sight that one of the higher figures was with climate change. This is a global existential crisis. It belongs to no region. It's not a north-south problem. It's real for the US, for Europe, and for the rest of the world as well. And I think we should pay attention to this. You know, and I say it also because a number of the countries that are also at the epicenter of a global sort of climate security challenge are also countries that are facing some kind of conflict situation. So here, South Sudan, for example, you know, the Sahel countries, for example, Nigeria about to go to elections, facing a herder farmer tension as well. So I don't think we should lose sight. Again, the technology conversation was important, but climate change is also
and I think as well
important.
that on the issue of climate change, I mean, here's an area where China could be in partnership with the rest of the world, and that could certainly build bridges.
Yeah.
But I do just want to jump back to AI for a second, Brad. On the question of US, China, and AI tech, who stands where? Who's ahead? Who's losing?
Well, the first thing I would say is this is a race where at any moment in time, the leader is probably leading by a matter of months, not years. Certainly here in 2023, I would say the U.S. is in the leadership position. That's fundamentally because of this partnership between OpenAI and Microsoft and the DeepMind, which was acquired by Google. But every day we're racing with the Beijing Academy of Artificial Intelligence, with a company like Baidu. And there's no reason to assume that one country or the other will have a sustainable leadership position. We're all going to have to keep racing ahead. I think to some degree, we also have to think about both the development of AI, but then the deployment of AI. Because ultimately, this is a race that is probably going to be won by a country or set of countries that deploys AI more broadly and more quickly in a manner that will both lead to its ongoing improvement and the productivity of their economies more generally. Now, if there's one thing we all have, I think, probably in common, it's that we haven't been to China since before the pandemic. And so I think it's really hard to take stock completely of what's happening in a place without going there. If I go back to pre-pandemic, I always felt at that point that China was not yet at a point where it was on par with, say, the US in developing AI, but they were going much faster in deploying it. And I'll be very curious to just go back and see how we take stock of that. And what that should really remind us of, I think, in Europe and in North America, Japan, South Korea, is we not only need to develop this technology, we have to put it to work, including in the defense sector, but more broadly, obviously.
I'm struck by what you said essentially about the economies incentivizing leaders to do the right thing. I'm not sure that one of the lessons of, maybe I've misunderstood you. I'm not sure one of the lessons of Ukraine and President Putin is that what you meant?
That's not what I meant, but I think it's a fair question to ask. And I would say more broadly, we should mostly take heart from the way the democratically elected leaders of the world have responded to the war in Ukraine. I think that is one of the things that I would say at least is a pleasant surprise, that the world has rallied the way it has. And I think the best way to avoid a war in the Pacific, you all are basically saying it, is to stand together to defend Ukraine in a war in Europe. And that kind of commitment clearly will not go unnoticed.
So following on from that, we've obviously had a good discussion on AI and the ways that it's going and can influence us. But there's much discussion about that positive or negative impact of technology has had on the war in Ukraine and more broadly in the security landscape. But here's the final viewer poll of our program. GZERO voters were asked this: technology is making the world safer more dangerous? I don't know. And here's how people responded. Safer, 31%. More dangerous, 42%. I don't know, 27%. Ian, your thoughts on that poll?
It's certainly making the world wealthier. And as a consequence of making the world wealthier, it's making people around the world safer. It's driven so much of the expansion of a global middle class. It's taken people out of poverty more quickly. Those are all things that make people safer. 8 billion people on the planet, they're better off because of technology. But they feel like technology is becoming more dangerous, and it's the speed.
And
it's the
this
speed,
last
it's
6
the
months too.
institutions not being aligned, it's feeling that they don't have leadership, they don't know who to trust, and they increasingly don't even know what information to trust. And so I think there is a real gap between having people understand what technology is doing, accept it and embrace it, and also government leaders being able to effectively harness it. That's where I think the gap you're seeing is.
Okay, we're coming close on time, so I'm going to ask you all just to give me some closing thoughts, and I'm going to start with you, Comfort, come back around the line to Ian.
Well, I think I'll just respond to what Ian said, that in a sense, the technology has become a double-edged sword. You know, it has a positive role, as you say, but it also has a negative role, and we've seen it play out, how leaders have misused it, misabused it, and used it for disinformation. But I think, you know, if we're worried about Ukraine today, I think what we should keep an eye on is how this global competition between the US and China can spiral into all sorts of unintended consequences in terms of their own relationship, and how that becomes a proxy, or other regions become a proxy for that competition. That, I think, is what worries me going forward as well.
Brad?
Well, I would zoom out and I would go back to the point about climate. Look, technology's been changing since about 1760 with the invention of the steam engine. It's been making the world more prosperous. It's been exacerbating certain income divides. If you look at 2021, the issue of the year at Munich, it was all virtual because it was COVID. If you look at 2022, the issue of the year was a looming war, which I think is the issue again this year. But the issue of the decade, maybe the issue of the century, is climate. It's the price that has been, the bill, if you will, that has been rising. The debt has been growing. Since the invention of the steam engine, we're going to have to come to terms with that. All of these other issues divide the world. That is, as you pointed out, the issue that hopefully can unite the world to do what needs to be done.
I'd like to follow up on that, though. Do you think it is? I mean, the indicators at the moment are the climate is looking terrible, but when push comes to shove with Russia, it's gas and oil are the central issue, which has led to the restarting of coal power stations, new oil fields being developed, which seems to be the slip has been to war rather than the off-ramp of climate change, which is not war, so we can take care of climate change.
I think the most interesting thing, and this is really about the war in the last year, is that I would suggest that in the short run, more fossil fuels will be burned in Europe in 2023 because of the war that began in 2022. But by 2025, and certainly by 2030, Europe will have transitioned even more to renewable energy than if this war hadn't taken place. And we're just working our way through that transition.
Benedetta, your closing thoughts?
Maybe, Mike, just to pick up on the last point, I think that's really important, because we have very quickly started to decouple our dependence on energy sources from Russia. And that's something that is going to have an impact on the energy transition, and I think a positive one. And that is, if you wish, a way to bring together responding to the climate crisis and also mitigating strategic vulnerability. So it's a win-win. The only parting thought I would have on that is that as we continue, as we should, at pace to transition away from fossil fuels, because climate change is real and it is an existential challenge, but we also must really pay attention not to wean ourselves off Russian oil and gas and sleepwalk into new strategic dependency from other potential competitors. And so that is going to be, to me, the real challenge. How do we implement our climate goals, implement our climate vision, transition away from fossil fuels, but remain vigilant about not importing new dependencies?
Yeah.
Well, Brad brought us back the last 2 years of Munich Security Conferences. I want to bring us back 3 years, 2020. I wonder if you remember what the theme was for 2020.
Westlessness.
Yes. Westlessness. Very well done, Benedetta.
Gold
Thank
star.
you.
That's a new one
10
on
points
me.
for NATO.
Well,
That's
10
a new one.
exactly
Yeah.
10 points for NATO. That's
Yeah.
right. Because today in 2023, there's no westlessness. There's westfulness.
Right.
Yeah.
The West is together. I want to be clear. The rest of the world's democracies are not with the West, and for very many reasons.
You can't
right?
end the conversation like this. I have to come back on
It's
that.
really important. I mean,
Yeah.
we just heard from Benedetta that we're going to see that this extraordinary decoupling from Russian energy.
Yeah.
Sure, for Europe,
Yeah.
not from India, not from China.
Yeah.
There's enormous decoupling in terms of strategic conversations. Not for the BRICS,
Yeah.
not for South Africa. I mean, what we're seeing is that a majority of the world's economic strength and certainly military strength really wants to put Russia back in a box. But a majority of the world's population does not. And that is because of what's happened with the pandemic. It's what happened with climate change. It's even what's happened on the back of this Russian invasion, because the Europeans are going to be able to deal with all of this dislocation. They can pay for it. They're moving fast. The developing countries, Pakistan can't even afford gas imports right now because the Europeans are taking it, and who's helping Pakistan? So I just think we have to understand. I'm happy to give the last word to comfort. I really am. But I really want us to all recognize that in a world of westfulness, where the Munich Security Conference feels aligned, the Russians are disinvited, the Iranians are disinvited, and the developing world is increasingly feeling distant and fragmented from the West, and we can't forget about that.
Yeah. No, I'm glad that you ended it that way, Ian, because I was concerned that you were going in another direction.
What direction did you think I was going?
Well,
Comrade?
because I also don't want anybody to leave this room with an assumption that the rest of the world, and I think that's an unfortunate sort of categorization, that the rest of the world is pro-Russia, because they're not, and I don't believe that's what you
No,
were.
not at all.
That's not what you were saying. So I'll backtrack and not have the last word. I would only say that we shouldn't allow the notion of westfulness to lead us down any route of complacency as well. Because it's the same notion of westfulness at the end of the Cold War that allowed for certain assumptions, and that allowed for, in a sense, for the West to sleepwalk and assume that it could, pool sovereignty and therefore democratize others who weren't necessarily interested in that agenda. So I would just be cautious about an assumption that the West has won at the moment as well.
What a great note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our program, coming to you live from the Munich Security Conference. Ian Bremmer, Benedetta Berti, Brad Smith, Comfort Aero, thank you all for your time and insights. You can follow GZERO's further coverage of the 2023 Security Conference and see more of the global stage content by heading to GZEROmedia.com/global stage. I'm Nick Robertson. Thank you all for watching and have a great weekend.